Marcus downloaded the app on a Tuesday, not because he suddenly got disciplined, not because he read a book or listened to a podcast. He downloaded it because his coworker Dana mentioned, casually over lunch, that she'd been putting $200 a month into index funds for 3 years, and her account had grown by more than he made in a month just sitting there. That was the moment. That specific Tuesday. That specific lunch. He opened the app that night after his daughter went to sleep. He had $400 he wasn't going to miss. He was ready. The app loaded, and there they were. Fund results. 3,000 with 400 options. Filters for asset class, expense ratio, Morningstar rating, ESG score, sector exposure, geographic allocation, dividend yield, beta, alpha, standard deviation, Sharpe ratio, fund family, inception date, minimum investment, tax efficiency, turnover rate. Marcus scrolled for 11 minutes. Then he closed the app. He told himself he'd come back when he had more time to research. He told himself this the same way he'd told himself in March, and in October before that, and the January before that. He still had the 400. It was still in his checking account, earning 0.01% annual interest, while inflation quietly consumed it at roughly 3.4% per year. He didn't lose the money in a bad trade. He didn't make a mistake. He made no decision at all. And that absence of a decision cost him more than most mistakes would have. This is not a story about laziness. This is a story about what happens to a human brain when it encounters a specific kind of environment it was never designed to navigate. There's a name for it. In the year 2000, a psychologist named Sheena Iyengar set up a table in a grocery store in California. The store was called Draeger's, the kind of place that prides itself on selection. She put out jams, exotic varieties, and she alternated. Some hours, 24 jars. Other hours, 6. When 24 jars were on display, 60% of shoppers stopped to look. When 6 jars were on display, only 40% stopped. So the bigger display won. More attention, more traffic, more interest. Except for one number, when 24 jars were available, 3% of the people who stopped actually bought something. When 6 jars were available, 30% bought. The smaller display converted at 10 times the rate. 10 times. Not slightly better. Not marginally more effective. An order of magnitude. That gap between stopping and buying, between interest and action, is the entire story of why Marcus still has $400 in his checking account 2 years after he downloaded that app. Fidelity offers over 10,000 mutual funds through its public screener. Not a typo. 10,000. In 2025 alone, the U.S. market added 1,097 new ETFs, bringing the total to over 4,800 exchange-traded funds. The global count of mutual funds grew from 60 to 400 in 2009 to 140,000 by 2023. Marcus's brain encountered not 24 jars of jam. It encountered 3,400 jars. On the first screen, before the filters, the jam experiment tells us what happens next, but it doesn't tell us why. And the why is where this gets strange. Because what's happening in Marcus's brain in that moment isn't failure. It's not weakness or avoidance or fear in any simple sense. What's happening is the correct functioning of a system built for a world that no longer exists. Your brain has a decision-making center, the prefrontal cortex, and it runs on glucose. Literally. When you evaluate options, compare alternatives, calculate trade-offs, you burn metabolic energy. This isn't a metaphor. Neuroscientists can track the metabolic cost of decision-making. The prefrontal cortex burns through glucose as it evaluates alternatives, and that cost is measurable. When the options are simple and distinct, this jam is strawberry, this one is mango, I prefer strawberry. The comparison is fast and cheap. The brain resolves it in milliseconds and moves on. When the options are complex and nearly identical, this ETF tracks the S&P 500 with a 0.03% expense ratio. This one tracks the S&P 500 with a 0.04% expense ratio. This one is slightly different because it uses a sampling methodology rather than full replication. This one has slightly higher turnover. The comparison doesn't resolve. The brain cannot find a clear winner. It keeps processing. The glucose keeps burning. And then a very specific thing happens. The brain does not say, "I'll just pick one. They're basically the same." The brain says, "The risk of choosing wrong is too high. I will come back to this when I have more information." This response has a technical name in behavioral economics: choice deferral. And it's not irrational. It is, in a specific and important sense, the correct response. Because for most of human history, the cost of deferring a decision was low, and the cost of making the wrong one could be catastrophic. Don't know which mushroom is safe? Don't eat any. Wait, come back. Ask someone who knows. The brain learned this deeply over hundreds of thousands of years. The problem is that a brokerage account is not a forest, and the wrong mushroom is not the same as the wrong ETF. The actual cost of investing in VOO instead of VTI over 30 years, for someone who isn't a professional allocator, is in almost every historical scenario too small to justify the paralysis the comparison creates. Both track broad market indices, both have expense ratios near zero, both would have turned Marcus's $400 into something meaningfully larger than $400. But his brain doesn't know that. His brain sees 3,400 options with ticker symbols he doesn't recognize, charts he doesn't know how to read, and a felt sense of enormous consequence. This is money. This is the future. This is a thing you can do wrong, and it activates the most ancient risk management system available. It closes the app, not because Marcus is weak, because Marcus is human. Nearly 800,000 employees, 647 different 401k plans. Researchers at Columbia and Wharton had access to every participation record. Not surveys, not self-reports. Actual data. What they found was a clean, consistent, negative correlation. As the number of fund options in a plan increased, participation rates fell. Not a noisy result. Not a marginal effect. A clear slope downward. And the employees who did participate when faced with more options made systematically worse choices. Not because they were less capable, but because when the comparison became impossible, they defaulted to the most conservative, most recognizable option available. Money market funds, savings accounts dressed up as investments. The thing that felt safest because it was most familiar. They were losing free money. Many of these plans had employer matching, free additional contributions, guaranteed 100% return on the first portion invested. Workers were opting out of free money because the selection mechanism was too cognitively expensive to complete. This is the infinite shelf effect, not just the paralysis, the whole system. The interface that presents too many options, the brain that correctly identifies the environment as too complex to process efficiently, the deferral response, the exit, the checking account, the slow erosion of purchasing power. It's a loop. And it has a beginning point, not in the individual, but in the architecture. The name matters. Give this thing a name and it changes what it is. When Marcus closes the app next time, and he will close it again because this doesn't resolve from one explanation, he will know what's happening. It won't feel like failure, it will feel like a system doing exactly what it was designed to do in an environment that wasn't designed for him. That shift from "I'm bad at this" to "this environment is miscalibrated for human cognition" is not a small thing. It's the difference between quitting and finding a different door. The JAM study explains what happens. It doesn't explain why 6 nearly identical ETFs can produce almost the same paralysis as 3,000. Because choice overload isn't just about having too many options. That's the easy version of the story. The harder version is about what happens when the options are similar. Researchers studying what they call choice deferral have identified a specific mechanism. It's not the absolute number of alternatives that shuts down decision-making most powerfully. It's the difficulty of relative comparison. If you gave Marcus a choice between a savings account, a house in the countryside, a share of Apple stock, and a mutual fund, 4 things. The comparison is hard, but tractable. The categories are distinct. He can reason about them differently. Now give him a choice between VOO, VTI, SCHB, IVV, SPY, ITOT. 6 funds, all of which track essentially the same broad market index, all of which have expense ratios between 0.03% and 0.09%. 6 options. But the relative comparison is nearly impossible because the differences are microscopic and technical. The brain cycles through them, finds no clear winner, cycles again, finds no winner again, and deploys the same protective response it would use for 500 options. This is why the JAM experiment's numbers transfer to finance, even though the magnitudes are different. The issue is not 6 versus 24. The issue is the cognitive cost of comparison given the comparability of the options. JAM with 24 varieties creates some paralysis. 6 nearly identical ETFs can create almost as much. 3,000 nearly identical ETFs is not a choice architecture. It's a cognitive blackout. But the number of options is only half the problem. When Marcus spent 11 minutes in that app without buying anything, his brain wasn't failing. It was, in a narrow neurological sense, enjoying itself. Dopamine doesn't fire primarily at the moment you acquire something. It fires during the anticipation, the evaluation, the sense that the optimal choice might be one more scroll away. He closed the app feeling like he'd done something. He hadn't. But his brain had been rewarded for the browsing itself, independent of any outcome. The process is not the action. The dopamine from browsing is not the compounding interest from investing. The app kept him engaged and sent him home empty-handed. This is also, for what it's worth, not accidental, though the intention behind it is more banal than conspiratorial. The engagement patterns of financial apps were built by engineers who learned their craft building social media products. Infinite scroll, endless filter combinations, always one more thing to look at. These patterns were optimized to maximize time in app, not assets under management. The financial industry built a social media product and called it a brokerage. Dana, Marcus's coworker, the one who mentioned her account over lunch, uses Betterment. She answered 3 questions when she signed up. How old are you? What are you saving for? How would you feel if your balance dropped 20% in a year? The algorithm took those answers and built her a portfolio. She didn't choose the funds. She didn't choose the allocation. She was presented with one thing and a button that said, Get Started. 3 years. $200 a month. She never opened the underlying fund list. She doesn't know what's in her portfolio at the ticker level, and it doesn't matter because the one decision she made, to start, is the decision that generates all the value. Betterment manages over $50 billion in assets. It didn't get there by offering more options than Fidelity. It got there by understanding that the infinite shelf effect exists and building the entire product around eliminating it. This is not a new insight, by the way. It's not a fintech discovery. In 1997, when Steve Jobs returned to Apple, the company was weeks from bankruptcy. The product line had expanded into dozens of overlapping computer models. Different numbers, different configurations, different versions for home, business, education, pro, each designed to serve a specific customer segment, each cannibalizing the clarity of all the others. Jobs walked in, drew a 2x2 grid on a whiteboard, consumer pro on one axis, desktop mesh portable on the other, and killed everything that didn't fit in one of the 4 resulting boxes. Over 70% of the product line. Gone. The people who ran Apple's product strategy at the time believed that more options meant more revenue. Jobs understood that more options meant more cognitive cost for the buyer, and more cognitive cost meant fewer decisions, which meant less revenue. Apple nearly went bankrupt because it forgot that decisions are expensive. Apple became the most valuable company in the world through a lot of things that came after 1997. But the decision that made everything else possible was the one Jobs made on a whiteboard. Stop making people choose between things they can't meaningfully distinguish. Fidelity has not yet had its Jobs moment. Neither has Schwab. Neither has most of the financial services industry. They're still at 1996 Apple, printing new models, new ETFs, new fund categories, new thematic instruments for clean energy and AI and space exploration, while the people who need simple, durable financial tools stand in the showroom, overwhelmed, and walk out without buying anything. And the cost of that isn't just their portfolios. It's a story they start telling themselves about who they are. There's a number that sits underneath all of this. 40%. According to a global survey of 13,000 people, 40% of adults worldwide consciously choose not to invest. Not because they lack money, but because the fear of an irreversible mistake is stronger than the cost of doing nothing. Marcus is not an outlier. He is the majority. And there's a generational shape to this that almost nobody talks about. Only 15% of millennials, Marcus's generation, began investing in college or early adulthood. Among Gen Z, born a decade later, that number is 30%, twice as high. The difference isn't that Gen Z is better with money. The difference is that they grew up with different shelves. Marcus's generation came of age precisely when the number of available funds was exploding, between 2000 and 2015, when the global fund count nearly doubled, without any corresponding improvement in the architecture of selection. They got more jam. Nobody removed jars. This is why the paralysis clusters in a specific demographic and feels, from the inside, like a personal failure. It is a cohort-level consequence of an industry-level design decision. There's one more mechanism worth naming, because it operates invisibly and almost nobody recognizes it while it's happening. When Marcus opens a financial app and feels that overwhelming, vaguely nauseating sense of too much, he doesn't just close the app and forget about it. He closes the app and feels bad about himself. He tells himself the story. I'm not a finance person. I don't understand this stuff. Maybe later when I know more. This story becomes the explanation for the absence of action. And over time it becomes a belief about capability. Researchers studying the moderating role of financial knowledge in choice overload found something specific. When investors with low financial literacy were shown large numbers of fund options, participation rates dropped to 65%. When the number of options was reduced, participation among the same low-knowledge group jumped to 80%. The knowledge didn't change. The person didn't change. The environment changed. Those 15 percentage points, the people who invested at 80% participation but not at 65%, were capable the whole time. They just encountered a cognitive load they couldn't navigate, and they interpreted that navigation failure as evidence of their own inadequacy rather than evidence of the environment's design. This is the mechanism behind the mechanism. The infinite shelf effect doesn't just prevent investment, it creates a story about the person who failed to invest. That story then becomes an additional barrier, because now Marcus doesn't just face a hard interface. He faces a hard interface while also believing, somewhere underneath the conscious level, that people like him probably can't figure this out anyway. The shelf doesn't just make the jam hard to choose, it makes you feel like someone who doesn't deserve jam. So here's where Marcus actually is. 2 years, 11 app opens, 11 closings. $400 still in the checking account, now worth effectively less than it was in real terms because his bank's interest rate is a fiction. The employer match he left on the table at work adds up to somewhere around $200 in free money he didn't collect, because navigating the 401k fund menu required 45 minutes of research he kept intending to do and never did. He's not behind because he's bad with money. He's behind because he walked into a system that was built by and for the 1% of people who actively enjoy analyzing fund metrics. And that system handed him 3,400 options as if that were a feature. The financial services industry grew up serving institutions, pension funds, endowments, and the kind of individual investor who has a Bloomberg terminal and 3 hours a day to watch markets. When retail access democratized in the late 90s and accelerated through the 2010s, the industry did not redesign for the new user. It took the professional interface, polished the graphics, made it available on mobile, and called it empowerment. Vanguard, the company that invented index investing, the company whose entire philosophy is built around simplicity and low cost, offers 228 funds in the United States. That sounds like restraint until you realize that 228 is still almost 40 times the threshold at which the JAM study found that buying behavior collapses. The industry's floor for simplified is above the ceiling at which human cognition functions well. The 401k study didn't show that workers lacked financial knowledge. It showed that when the number of options dropped, the same workers, same income, same education, started making decisions they couldn't make before. The shelf changed. The person didn't. The one thing behavioral economics has consistently demonstrated about choice architecture is this: the structure of the decision shapes the decision more than the content of the decision. How you present the options determines what gets chosen more reliably than what the options actually are. This is why auto-enrollment in 401k plans dramatically outperforms opt-in enrollment. Not because the investment choices changed, but because the default changed. The structure flipped. Instead of, you must actively choose to participate, the default became, you are participating unless you actively opt out. Participation rates under opt-in, roughly 60 to 70%. Participation rates under auto-enrollment, above 90%. Same people, same funds, same employer, different architecture. The decision that generates wealth isn't which fund, it's whether to start. And the barrier to starting isn't knowledge or money. For Marcus, for the 40% who don't invest at all, and the additional fraction who open apps and close them without acting, the barrier is the friction created by an interface that forces an impossible comparison before it allows a simple action. The infinite shelf effect needs three things to work: a brain with limits, a decision that feels expensive to get wrong, and a shelf that was never built for you. Change anyone, and the loop breaks. The brain's limits don't change. Those are hardware. The perception of stakes can shift. That's what education does when it works. But the fastest lever, and the one the industry most reliably ignores, is the architecture. Marcus opened a different app last week. Not because he got smarter about finance, not because he did more research. He opened it because Dana, the same coworker, the same lunch, told him the name of the app she uses. He answered the same 3 questions she had answered 3 years earlier. He transferred the $400 he'd been sitting on. He didn't know what was in the portfolio. He still doesn't, at the ticker level. But here's the thing about Marcus's decision. It was functionally equivalent to what a Columbia-educated financial analyst would have recommended: a diversified portfolio of low-cost index funds, automatically rebalanced, allocated for his age and risk tolerance. He got the right outcome not by acquiring more knowledge. He got it by encountering a different shelf. This is the actual lesson of the JAM study, and not that fewer options make people happier, though they often do. The lesson is that the architecture of a decision system determines who can participate in it. When the shelf has 24 jars, the people who buy JAM are mostly people who already know what they want. Everyone else leaves. When the shelf has 6 jars, the people who buy JAM include the people who weren't sure, the people who were curious but uncertain, the people who would have benefited from the JAM but felt unqualified to choose. A financial system that works only for people who already know exactly what they want isn't offering choice. It's offering the appearance of choice to people who were always going to be excluded by the complexity of it. There's something Marcus said when Dana asked him why it took 2 years. He said, "I didn't think I was ready." He meant, he didn't think he knew enough. He didn't think he was the kind of person who invested. He thought there was a threshold of understanding he needed to cross before he had permission to act. That threshold doesn't exist. It was the shelf. The sense that you need to understand all 3,400 options before you're qualified to choose one of them. That you need to be fluent in expense ratios in alpha and beta before you can put $200 a month somewhere it will grow. That feeling is not the voice of prudent financial caution. It is the infinite shelf effect, telling you that you're not ready. You were ready 2 years ago. The shelf wasn't. There's a name for what's happening to them. The infinite shelf effect. It's not a character flaw. It's not a knowledge deficit. It's a brain doing exactly what it was built to do, and an industry that built its product for someone else. The question is never, why can't I make this decision? The question is, who designed this shelf?